Howdy! I know there's some Aggies here. Thank you very much. I'm Andy Card. I come from Massachusetts, so I parked the car in Harvard Yard. You might not understand me all the time. But I live in Bryan College Station, Texas right now. I'm proud to be in Aggie land and proud to be associated with the George and Barbara Bush Foundation. President George H.W. Bush was my great hero. That picture is an iconic photograph. I am not iconic, but it defines an era. Most of you in this audience either weren't born or you were just born when it happened, 23 years ago. And I want to tell you, I was privileged to be the Chief of Staff to President George W. Bush. I was Deputy White House Chief of Staff for George H.W. Bush, Secretary of Transportation for George H.W. Bush, and I also got to work for President Ronald Reagan. This is a great nation. It's a great nation because we, the people, are active in it. And the Constitution is a remarkable document. You are part of the we. And many of you actually have accepted the invitation to be part of the government. And you've made sacrifices to be part of the government. And I honor that. And it's up to you to polish our democracy. It's up to you to say thank you for people who helped us have a great government. And I'm thrilled to be here as we honor veterans that have made a difference. And to see these Medal of Honor winners that you've had the privilege to listen to is just a remarkable thing. So thank you. How many of you were born after 9/11? Thank you. You may look at what happened on 9/11 and think of a video game. It was not a video game. It was the real deal. And those of us who lived during that time remember the trauma of watching people literally jump out of a 60-story building because they couldn't take the heat behind them. Many of you don't think it's possible that some would fly a plane and use it as a weapon of mass destruction and crash into towers or the Pentagon, or have the first heroes in the war on terror who were not in the military. If they were, they would have been presented Medal of Honors, but they were just passengers on a plane. And someone said, let's roll, and they rolled, and that plane crashed into the field in Pennsylvania. I was with the president on 9/11. The president had left Washington, D.C. to go to Jacksonville, Florida on September 10th to do an event for students. Back in Washington, D.C., he had just come from an event honoring Australia and their partnership with us in every political battle we've had. And there was a big parade at the Navy Yard here in the Washington, D.C. area. The Prime Minister of Australia, John Howard, was there, received a bell that was taken off of a ship that the Australians helped protect during World War II. There was great pomp and circumstance. There were 21 gun salutes, remarkable remarks, and tremendous gratitude for the Australian people helping us when we were in harm's way and helping to win World War II. And every other war that we've been in, the Australians have been there to help us. So we left a fancy event in Washington, D.C., and we went in on Air Force One and flew to Jacksonville, Florida. In Jacksonville, the president did an event at a school, and after that event, he flew to the other side of Florida, Sarasota, Florida, and we arrived at a hotel in the Sarasota region, right near an elementary school, the M.E. Booker School. And I remember when we arrived and the motorcade came to a stop and the Secret Service opened up the door to the limousines and we stepped out, there was a terrible stench in the air. The red tide had killed some fish and they washed up on the shore and it just stunk. And I was struck by the terrible smell when I got out of the limousine. We rushed into the Colony Resort, dropped down our luggage, and then we came out and piled up into the limousines again and did something that President Bush did not do very often. We went out to an event that was not a political event, not a fundraising event. It was a dinner that his brother, the governor of Florida, had arranged, and it was just a fun evening that wasn't supposed to take very long. The president actually stayed out late. We got back to the Colony Resort unusually late for George W. Bush, who liked to go to bed pretty early. And I remember I had work to do, so I went down to an office and did some work, and then I went to bed, woke up the next morning, and I went down to see the president. He was up and about getting on some jogging clothes because he was going to go for a run on the golf course. And I remember it was lots of things going on, but it was all good news. Good news about education, good news about our economy, good news about foreign affairs. And the president was in his jogging outfit, getting ready to go for a run, and then he realized that the person that he invited to go for a run was a reporter named Stretch Kyle, but he found out Stretch Kyle had been an NCAA All-American cross-country runner. And he kept saying, I don't know why I invited him to go to running. Why didn't somebody tell me he was a cross-country runner in college? And he was all preoccupied this, and the Bushes are very competitive. They don't even let the grandkids win at checkers. So he went out for a run, and I said, when you get back, we'll do the CIA briefing. It's going to be an easy day because you're going to go to an elementary school. So he goes out for the run. I'm doing some work. One of the jobs of a chief of staff is you have to read everything that the president's going to read before the president gets it. So I had a lot of homework to do. And he came back from the run, and he was full of himself. He had a strut, that Texas strut, because he beat Stretch Kyle, and he felt very good about it. And he starts to say, this is going to be an awesome day. And I said, yes, this is going to be an awesome day. Next stop is the Emma E. Booker Elementary School, and you're going to be reading books with second graders. And he was all excited about it. We went down to get into the limousines to head over to the Emma E. Booker School. And I remember the limousine line was a little bit different, and I had to go chastise some of the advance team and say, we've got to move this vehicle here, and change some changes in the motorcade that was going over to the school. And then I heard two people ask, did anybody hear about a plane crash in New York City? One was Karl Rove, the other one was Dan Bartlett, both Texans, and didn't know much about it. We arrived at the school. The president got on a secure phone with Condoleezza Rice as national security advisor. I didn't hear that. I went into the school and into the classroom where the president was going to be to make sure it was ready for him. I remember stepping into the classroom and looking around, and I was always looking for things that other people should have seen but didn't, like misspelled words. And I saw a word misspelled on a bulletin board, and I said, let's get a book cover and cover that up. I didn't want a Dan Quayle potato moment. You don't remember that. I then walked into the classroom and saw the teacher getting ready to bring the students in, and the press pool was gathering with Ari Fleischer, the press secretary, and he's got a friend that's right over here. And I looked over at the press pool, and the press pool was undisciplined, kind of out of character, and the students were completely in character and very well disciplined. It was a big contrast. I then went into the holding room with the president and the principal of the school. When the acting national security advisor on the trip, a Navy captain at the time, she went on to become an admiral, Deb Lauer, came up to me and said, and the president, she said, sir, it appears a small twin-engine prop plane crashed into one of the towers at the World Trade Center in New York City. The president, the principal, and I all had the same reaction. Oh, what a horrible accident. The pilot must have had a heart attack or something. And then the principal opened the door to the classroom, and she and the president walked into the classroom. The door shut, and Captain Lauer came up to me and said, sir, it appears it was not a small twin-engine prop plane, it was a commercial jetliner. My mind then flashed to the fear the passengers on the plane must have had. They had to know it was losing altitude. I'd assumed it took off from Liberty Airport in Newark, or maybe JFK, or LaGuardia. And then that reaction caused me to think, what's going on, obviously, but I still thought it was an accident. But Captain Lauer came up to me and said, oh my God, another plane hit the other tower at the World Trade Center. That caused me to have to do something that chiefs of staff do all the time, including right now, dealing with the question, does the president need to know? Yes, the president would need to know. I made a decision to pass on 2 facts and make 1 editorial comment, and to do nothing to invite a conversation with the president. I knew that he was sitting in front of second graders, in front of a press pool, and probably underneath the boom microphone that would pick up the conversation. I made a decision what I would say. I opened the door to the classroom and stepped in, and the students were conducting or in the middle of a dialogue with the president. The teacher was saying, say good morning to the president. Good morning, Mr. President. The president would answer back, good morning to you. And there was this dialogue going back and forth between the students and the president, and I didn't want to interrupt it. Ann Compton from ABC News was in the press pool, and she saw me come into the room, and it was unusual for me to enter the room when the president had already entered, and it was certainly unusual for me to come in from kind of backstage and walk up to him. And she said, and I said, and she said, and then I heard the teacher say to the students, take out your books and read, we're going to read with the president. As the students were reaching under their desks to get their books, that's when I walked up to the president, and I leaned down and I whispered into his right ear, a second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack. I then stood back from him because I did not want him to talk with me. So I took 2 steps back. I saw his head bobbing up and down. He kind of glanced right, but never turned around, and I was very pleased with how he reacted, because he did nothing to scare those second graders. He did nothing to demonstrate fear to the media that would have translated it for the terrorists to be cheering. Instead, I think the president actually focused on what his real job was. I don't want to say that's when he became president. He became president when he took the oath of office and then delivered his inaugural address. On this day, I think he realized what his real job as president was to keep his oath, to preserve, protect, and defend the United States. So I was pleased with how the president reacted. He focused on his job. The students were focused on their books. I went back to the door of the classroom, looked around and saw the students again eager to read, the president still with his head bobbing up and down. And then I saw the press pool, and all of the reporters were turned around talking to Ari Fleischer. None of them were paying attention to the president. I then stepped into the holding room, and the first thing I said to the staff was, get a line open to the FBI director, Bob Mueller. He'd only been the FBI director for 10 days. Get a line open to the vice president, get a line open to the Situation Room back at the White House. Get the crew back on Air Force One. Mark Tillman with the pilot, get your crew members all back on Air Force One. We're likely going to have to get out of here. To the Secret Service, I said, get the motorcade turned around. We're going to be going back to the airport. To Dan Bartlett, I said, get some remarks written for the president. We've got 600 people in the gymnasium. He'll have to talk to them. He cannot say anything we do not know to be the truth. The president then came out of that classroom. He excused himself to the students, to the media, and he came into the holding room. And the first thing he said was, get the FBI director on the phone. And we could say, he's right here, Mr. President. Then he talked to the vice president. He talked to his national security advisor. He talked to the governor of New York, tried to reach the mayor of New York City. I then ran around the building and went into the room where the 600 people from the community were and stood at the back of the room, and I saw the president come in with Secretary of Education Ron Page, and I stood there as the president walked in and went to the podium, and the first thing he said was, I'm going to have to be going back to Washington, D.C. And then he explained what had just happened. It was a very short address, but I was not pleased because I don't think that it was true that we were going back to Washington, D.C. We didn't know enough to say that we could do that. So I kind of got a little angry with Dan Bartlett. And I ran around the building to get into the motorcade with the president. I saw Dan Bartlett, and I said, Dan, why did you let him say we're going back to Washington, D.C.? He said, I didn't. The president just said that he was going back to Washington, D.C. I said, we do not know that yet. We drove very fast to the airport in Saratoga and ended up getting on Air Force One. I should tell you that when the motorcade showed up and the Secret Service opened the door to the Beast, the presidential limo, I was struck by a protocol no-no. The engines on Air Force One were already running. And the protocol is that you do not turn the engines on until the president's safely on the plane. So I said, Mark Tillman, the pilot, must really want to get out of here fast. We ran up the gangplank. Almost before the door was shut, the plane started rolling down the runway, and we took off at a very steep incline to 48,000 feet. We flew in a serpentine way, waiting for fighter jets to catch up with us. And the president is saying, where are we going? We're going back to Washington, D.C., he tells me. I said, you don't know that yet. I don't think you want to make that decision yet. He says, I'm making the decision. We're going back to Washington, D.C. And I said, I don't think you really want to make that decision yet. I do. And I said, I don't think you want to make it right now. We'll have to make that decision later. And I went up and talked to Mark Tillman. He says, we're not landing at Andrews, Joint Base Andrews, unless we know the plane can get in there safely. So the president is not overriding me. The Secret Service says we're not going back to Washington, D.C. unless we can know that we can protect the president when he gets there. We're also trying to learn what's been going on. And I'll fast forward and say, please go back and look at this in history and see what was going on. 2 planes crashing in New York City, 1 plane crashing in the Pentagon, another plane being driven down into Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And you should read the story of all of the people that were on those planes and the trauma that they went through. It's unbelievable. You have a duty to know about it. You have to help us who are old. Yes, the people in the audience that were alive on 9/11, because we all made the same promise. We promised never to forget. We all promised it. No matter what our station in life was, no matter what our faith was, no matter what our emotions were, we promised never to forget. And there were heroes, and you're going to hear from some heroes today on 9/11. I just plead with you, and I'm jealous. I would like to be your age. I'd love to be your age. But I can honestly tell you, I am not your age, but it's important for you to make sure people your age understand what happened on 9/11 and how it changed the world. It changed the world because it changed bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. It changed diplomacy around the world. It changed the partnerships that we have with people around the world, and I watched the president be a phenomenal leader. The bottom line is, as we flew from Florida to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, where we took people off of the Air Force One and said, you're extraneous to this trip. There were members of Congress, guests. You get off the plane. We're going to Stratcom in Omaha, Nebraska, where there's great communications and a way to deal directly with the FAA and the military about all the work that they did. And I want you to recognize the leadership that it took to do all of that, and it was great leadership from the president. The very first thing he did that struck me in response to what happened after he got on Air Force One, he wanted to make sure President Putin wasn't doing anything stupid and thinking that we were using this as a way to attack Russia. And he had Condoleezza Rice call Putin up and say, this is what's happening, don't you overreact to anything. Very important that we did that. He ended up becoming an ally for a short time in the process. In fact, it was almost this time in 2001 where Putin came to Texas and went to Crawford, Texas, to the president's ranch. and it was in response to the way the Russians were actually helping us fight some of the terrorism that we faced. So I'm pleading with you to go back and see why that picture is iconic, and it's not iconic because of me, but the day was iconic. There was no TSA before that. There was no Homeland Security Department before that. The CIA and the FBI intelligence communities didn't talk to each other before that. So government changed, we changed, the world changed, and we're still carrying most of those changes right now. With that, I'm going to say thank you, and I'm going to thank you in advance for keeping this conscience such that you will never forget what happened that day, and respect the heroes that showed up to make a difference, especially the firefighters and the policemen that raced into the building. Remember those people who jumped out of the building. Remember the passengers on Flight 93 that responded when one person said, "Let's roll." Remember what happened, how we could say that the president called for the world to stand with us. He called for world leaders to say, you're either with us or against us. And yes, I can remember Muammar Gaddafi being the first leader to call back, saying, I'm with you, I am with you, do not bomb me. And the president of Pakistan saying, I want to be with you and against you. But the president held strong, and he built a coalition that made a difference. With that, now I want you to bring up some of the heroes of 9/11 and have them tell their stories. As they're gathering, I want you to think some questions. I'll try to have an opportunity for some cues to come up if you want to ask us some questions. So. Would you like to sit down? Yes. I'm going to sit. They're going to introduce themselves as they sit down.
There's water for you.
Set change.
Exactly. Go ahead, Ken.
As we get organized here, I must admit I was quite surprised to see how many hands went up when Andrew asked if you were born before 9/11 and how many of you were not born before 9/11. There are a few times in our lives throughout history when you can remember exactly where you were and exactly what you were doing when you got a certain piece of news. November of '63, I was in San Angelo, Texas, and I remember exactly where I was, exactly what I was doing when someone said to me, the president's been shot. And I responded, the president of what? I remember exactly where I was and exactly what I was doing on 9/11 in 2001. And I'm going to suggest to you that your parents and grandparents, and many people here know exactly where they were and exactly what they were doing on that fateful day. There are very few times in history, throughout all of history, where you can ask people that were alive at the time that question, and they will know without hesitation exactly where they were and exactly what they were doing. So with that, we're going to ask our 9/11 panel to please come up. We're going to thank Andrew Card again and for his service and his leadership.
Tim, pleasure.
See you.
Thanks. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, brother.
You're awesome. Thank you. I am not going to moderate the conversation. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, say why they're here, and why we do honor them.
I'm Tim Brown, FDNY, obviously, firefighter and 9/11 survivor of the collapse of both buildings. I was in the 7 World Trade Center when the first plane came in, working for Mayor Giuliani. I survived, but 343 of my brothers did not survive. 70 plus law enforcement officers did not survive, and every one of them knew the challenge in front of them and took the challenge and fulfilled their oath. I am here to talk about their stories, the uniformed police officers and firefighters who were heroes that day, as well as the military and a lot of the civilians who we have here with us. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Ron DiFrancesco. I'm known as the last survivor out of the South Tower of the World Trade Center tragedy. I was working that day on the 84th floor, and I saw the first plane hit, and I was still on our floor when the second plane hit. Had a harrowing experience trying to get out of the building, and I never got out. I ended up in the basement of the building and woke up 3 days later in the hospital. Coming here to talk to you, to see the veterans and the young cadets, just to give you some insight on what you're doing, what you have done in the past is very important, and I thank you all.
I'm Heather Penny. On the morning of September 11th, I was sent on a suicide mission in my F-16 to ram it into Flight 93. The passengers on Flight 93 are the true heroes, though, because they were the ones that prevented that airliner from reaching our nation's capital. I'm here today not only to honor and commemorate their sacrifice and their service, as well as those that are on the panel here today, but also to share with you what your service will mean and how you can prepare yourselves.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bill Van Scoik. I work for Morgan Stanley, and I was actually in charge of a class of 276 folks from all across the country that were on day 2 of a 3-week training program. Imagine being from outside of, New York and from North Dakota and Alaska and everything else. New York is a pretty scary place in and of itself under regular circumstances. And the events that happened, obviously, no one had envisioned whatever happened. But why do I come here every year to talk about this? It's very simple. When I look at you and I see these young faces, this is my 4th year being out here to talk about this. It's important for me, having experienced it and seeing what I saw that day, that all of you, who, God bless all of you, we count on, depend upon, and love more than anything in this world, that you understand the resiliency of our country that day. You understand the resiliency and strength of the human spirit that day. And you see what we should be appreciative of every single day in this country, which is the freedoms that we have, that freedom isn't free. And there's always someone, the wolf is always at the door. So just be reminded of that. But thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
President Bush had to make some very tough decisions. And on Air Force One, soon after we took off from Sarasota, I do remember the president getting a call from the Vice President Dick Cheney. And I was sitting with the president in his office on Air Force One, right opposite him, and I couldn't hear Dick Cheney's conversation, but I could hear the president's responses. And I remember the president said, yes, I would approve that. Yes, I would approve that. Yes, I would approve that. And it was when Dick Cheney was saying, can we authorize our fighter pilots to shoot down commercial jetliners that are not responding to the FAA instructions to land? And I do remember the president authorizing it. I think actually Dick Cheney gave the authorization a little bit prematurely, but nevertheless, I heard the president authorize it. And when he hung up the phone, he leaned forward and he said to me, I was an Air National Guard pilot. I cannot imagine receiving that order. So I ask you, Kathleen, what was it like to receive the order?
I was in the DC Air National Guard, a young lieutenant. I just got into my fighter squadron that January and had earned my combat mission ready status that March. So I really wasn't any older than you. You're going to graduate, you're going to receive your commission, you will take your oath of office, and then you'll go get your training and then go to your first operational unit. It's not too far in the future for you. That's where I was that morning. As the District of Columbia Air National Guard, we have two chains of command. One when we are federalized and we deploy overseas to go do the job that our nation has asked us to do to project power, to protect our nation and our nation's interests. And when that happens, we essentially become part of the active duty Air Force. The rest of the time, the National Guard, the chain of command, goes up through their governor. And this is how we get guardsmen filling sandbags and responding to hurricanes and things like that. But the District of Columbia Air National Guard does not have a governor. And our commander-in-chief during peacetime operations is not the mayor. It goes all the way up to the president. So when Vice President Cheney called the president and asked for authorization, that was what we had to wait for before we could launch. Now I have to back up a little bit because this is September 11th of 2001. That morning, before the first aircraft hit, we were still living in a pre-9/11 world. The Soviet Union had fallen, it had collapsed, we had won the Cold War, it was the end of history, it was a unipolar world, and during the 1990s, the nation cut the Air Force in half, literally. So all of the alert units that had ringed the United States to protect our borders from incoming Soviet nuclear bombers, that had been reduced to 5 units in the entire United States. Portland, Fresno, Homestead, Langley, and Otis, New York. That was it. The District of Columbia, sitting over here just on the other side of the Potomac River, the DC Guard was no longer an alert unit because our nation could not imagine a threat to our homeland. Our nation could not imagine a world where there would be countries, nation states, or individual terrorist extremist organizations that might want to challenge our influence and the order that we had set post-World War II. So we don't have any missiles. We don't have any bombs. We are not loaded up in a go-to-war configuration. And as a matter of fact, the alert jets at those 5 units, they did not take off normally loaded with hot missiles. They just had hot guns, 510 rounds each of highly explosive incendiary bullets. But we didn't even have that. We had our normal standard training rounds of 105 lead-nosed bullets. It's like 20-millimeter BB guns. And no hot missiles, no explosive, real live, come off the rails with rockets, blow up kind of missiles. And we wouldn't get them in time. That morning, the struggle it took for us to be able to work through that chain of command, to get the missiles built up in time, to launch, it really was a consequence of the leadership, the insight, and the teamwork of the senior officers within our squadron. Again, remember, I'm a lieutenant. I'm pretty green. My job is a snacko, right? It's my job to make sure there's plenty of snacks, fresh beer, hot coffee, and fresh popcorn in the bar, right? Like, that's my job. So what was going on that morning was our leadership, Mark Sasseville, who was our director of operations, Dan Kane, who was our weapons officer, Mark Valentine, who was our scheduler, David McNulty, who was our intelligence officer, Phil Thompson, who was our supervisor of flying. They were all coordinating and doing what they could based off of what we knew when we go to war to try to improvise for something that we had never been trained for. There were no tactics, techniques, procedures, no air tasking order. They were making it all happen. I will go into some detail later on, but I absolutely want to make time for the other individuals to be able to tell their stories.
What story would you like to tell them that impacted you the most?
Well, I'm a civilian, and I was trading that day. I traded Eurodollars and European currencies, and I love the fast pace. I'm a Canadian, and so working in the World Trade Center, an iconic building, and New York City was unbelievable. I got seriously blindsided that day. I was trapped above the impact zone. As I was leaving our trading room, the second plane hit. I was on the 84th floor. It hit from the 78th to the 85th floor. The right wing sliced straight through our trading room. We got knocked by all the debris, knocked over, and we made our way into the stairwell. But the stairwell below was collapsed. And there were all kinds of people panicking. And from the 93 bombing, people thought if they went up, they would be rescued from up top. We climbed to about, I guess, the 110th floor and realized we couldn't get out of the building. And at that point, true panic started to set in. So I started to go back down, and I was with a whole bunch of my colleagues, and the smoke was quite thick and heavy, and we started to lie down. And people were going to sleep, and I thought to die. But someone called me, and those of you who believe in a higher being, a God, know who that is. Others may think it was my adrenaline running overtime, but I got up, made my way into the darkest of smoke, and pulled back a sheet of drywall, and I slid down that, and I ran through 3 flights of stairs that were on fire. About halfway down, I ran into 3 firefighters coming up. And I didn't know how badly I'd been burnt, but they just told me to go down and I'd get help down below. When I got down there, I came out facing the courtyard in between the 2 buildings, and it was a war zone, folks, a war here. And I hadn't been trained for any of that. I was in a situation that I knew nothing about how to control. I was sent downstairs to get out towards the Church Street exit. And as I was leaving, I ran into a colleague of mine who on the best of days had trouble walking. And as we were walking towards the Church Street exit, that's when we heard the building start to come down. I ran as fast as I could, and that's all I remember. I woke up 3 days later. I had burns on 60% of my body. I had a massive laceration in my head. My contact lenses were melted to my eyes. But I was alive and thankful for everybody who helped me after 9/11 to get me where I am. I still struggle on a daily basis, and talking about this now is challenging, but I want you to know what you're doing is a good thing, and yeah, that's it.
The New York City Fire Department had so many heroes we can't list them, in all honesty. And their traditions go on today, that there's generation after generation saying, I want to be there. I had the privilege of meeting with several members of the New York City Fire Department, even within the last year, that they would be here telling their story because they want you to know. But they actually would rally and do it again on a moment's notice.
Yes, sir.
So why don't you talk about some of your colleagues and
Thank you. Thank you, sir. I am here for them. I am here for my friends. 100 of those firefighters were my friends in the Special Operations Command. So 343 New York City firefighter heroes were murdered on September 11th by a radical Islamic terrorist. 100 of them were from our Special Operations Command. So basically, if you were working in our Special Operations Command on 9/11, the night before or the day tour, it was the end of your life because they all went up in the towers. I'd like to tell one little vignette, quick, that is an example of what they all did and what the police officers did. And I came into the North Tower pretty quickly after the first plane struck. And I was at the plaza level, so to go down one level, I had to go down an escalator. There were hundreds of civilians getting onto that escalator like a funnel. And I got into that group, and as I went down the escalator, if you can imagine with me, the lobby of the North Tower started to reveal itself to me. And there were hundreds of firefighters in their gear with 80 or 100 pounds of equipment awaiting their orders to go up in their protective gear with the yellow stripes, right? The reflective stripes. And I had to very reluctantly admit to myself in that moment something that is hard for me to do, and that was to say, damn, the cops were right. Because the cops called us bumblebees, and now I saw hundreds of firefighters in the lobby with their yellow stripes, and it looked just like a beehive. And I had never seen it that way before, but I would reluctantly admit it that the cops were right. And the cops will get that. But I got to the bottom of the escalator, and right there to my right-hand side was a bumblebee. And I looked up at his face, and it was my friend, firefighter Chris Blackwell from Rescue 3, the Bronx Harlem Fire Department, where I worked. I worked with Chris for 7 years on the same shift. And so he was like a real brother to me. We did everything together. We went to terrible, terrible building collapses, fires, car crashes, and things like that. And not only was Chris this badass Bronx Harlem elite firefighter, but when he went home to Connecticut, he was a paramedic at home. So all he did with his whole life was help other people, right? Because that's who we are, that's what we do. We're helpers, we're protectors. And that was Chris. Whenever we had a patient, especially if it was a child patient, we always looked for Chris's hands to put that child in, because we knew in his hands that child had the best shot at life. And Chris and I always greeted each other the same way, that no matter what disaster we were about to take on, we always took a second to greet each other. And we did this on the morning of September 11th in the North Tower lobby. So I get to the bottom of the escalator, and here's the bumblebee firefighter Chris Blackwell. As soon as he saw me, we both turned toward each other. We came to attention. He was standing right here, and he would make a big motion with his arm and take the unlit stub of a cigar out of his mouth, and he would put it down to his side, and we would both lean in at the waist, kiss on the lips, come back to attention, and he put the cigar back in his mouth. And we did it for two reasons. We did it because we were like real brothers. I grew up with brothers. We always kissed on the lips. I kissed my dad on the lips. It was no big deal. And we did it because we loved each other. But it freaked out all the cops and firemen around us. And we loved watching that reaction around us in the middle of this chaos. And after we did that, Chris said to me, "Timmy, this is really bad." And for us to say that to each other is a significant thing. I said, "I know, Chris, be careful, I love you." And he said, "I love you too." And after those words, firefighter Chris Blackwell turned around and went in the stairwell and went up to save the lives of people he didn't know. Why? He could have turned around and gone home to his family, to his loving wife and children. But he didn't. He went up that stairwell. Why? Because 15 years earlier, he took an oath. In that oath, it said he promised to give his own life for his friends, his neighbors, or strangers. But this was the moment those words were tested. And he fulfilled his oath. I call it, because it's written about in the Bible, I call it the greatest love. So that's what I want you to remember from the heroes of 9/11, the police officers, the firefighters, military, former military who stepped up on that day, and civilians who took it upon themselves to, at the end of their life, the very last act of their life, every one of them performed an act of the greatest love.
If you don't mind, I'd love to tell you the story of my most memorable days as White House Chief of Staff. And it's a phenomenal privilege to be the Chief of Staff to the President. And I would caution you, if you ever apply to be the Chief of Staff, you will not become the Chief of Staff. And I had no idea that the President was recruiting me to be his Chief of Staff. I actually tried to talk him out of it. But watching the President on 9/11, and remember, George W. Bush got elected president by the Supreme Court. It was a very controversial election, and he took office with some people refusing to call him Mr. President. He maintained his honor and his obligations, and he believed in the oath that he took, and he couldn't wait to take it. But he also had tremendous empathy for those who took an oath because he took an oath. Because presidents don't get to implement any of their orders. Other people do it. And it ended up expanding all through the whole country. America came together, not because of President Bush, because of heroes like these heroes. So I want to tell you my 4 most memorable days. The dust had settled. We knew about the attacks. We knew where they happened. We saw the carnage. The President had been to the hospitals to see people. He'd been to funerals. And he convened a meeting in the White House where he wanted to meet with the FBI and find out what they were doing. So he called this meeting. It was on the Thursday after the attacks. And the President said he wanted to convene the cabinet on Friday. So Friday came and we got together. Bob Mueller, the FBI director, came in with an assistant. And he was asked at the end of the security briefing that the President had from the CIA, I'd like to know what the FBI is doing. And the briefer said, this is what the FBI is doing. They're investigating a crime. And they were investigating a crime. And they talked about the material that they would find and the witnesses that they had. And the President interrupted and said, that's all very important. But of greater concern to me is, what are you doing to prevent the next attack? Smart. And I will admit, the briefer didn't know how to react to that, and looked down the couch to the FBI director, Bob Mueller, and Bob Mueller looked at the Attorney General, and the Attorney General looked back at the briefer looked back at the FBI director, and Bob Mueller says, Mr. President, we'll have to get back to you on that. Wow. It sounds weird and out of touch, but that's where the mindset was. The meeting ended, and I went and stood at my favorite spot in the Oval Office. I was always looking for a corner to hide in the Oval Office, but there are no corners. So I would stand beside the grandfather clock as everybody was leaving the room. And I'm there, and Bob Mueller and the briefer walked by me, and Bob Mueller turns to the briefer and said, when we get back to the Bureau, we're changing the mission of the Bureau. It's now to prevent the next attack. And that may not sound like a big deal, but do you know how much effort it takes to change the mission of a government agency? They really did change their mission, and it made a difference. The president also said to me, after everyone had walked out of the room, I want you to convene the War Council tomorrow at Camp David. And I'm thinking to myself, there's no such thing as the War Council. But I know what you mean. And I said, how about 10 o'clock Saturday, Camp David, National Security Council will get together.
Right.
He said, yes, do that. So I run off and do the homework and call people and make arrangements to get everything done. I then go back down to the Oval Office to report that everybody's on set, all set with it, and he's meeting with the person in charge of Cabinet Affairs and getting ready for a cabinet meeting, and the president is being handed a stack of cards. These are what you're supposed to use at the cabinet meeting. These are the issues we want to talk about. And I remember the president looking at them and going through them, and then the cabinet starts to arrive, and we walk into the cabinet room. Everybody stands for the president as he goes in. He sits down, they sit down. The cards come out, he puts them on the table, and then he puts his hand over the card and is not going to read them. Instead, he says, we are at war. But while we are at war, we have a job of governing to do. So with phenomenal specificity, he addressed every member of the cabinet about their responsibilities. And it was a tour de force in terms of knowing what the responsibilities were. This wasn't from a script. He talked about the priorities of those departments and agencies. And then he adjourned the meeting after a prayer. We started with a prayer, we ended with a prayer. And then everybody went out and piled into limousines, and they came up to this part of Washington, D.C., the National Cathedral, not too far away from here. And went in there, and it was packed. Every pew was filled. There were representatives of every faith in America. And we said prayers. We sang hymns. We listened to phenomenal responsibilities that come from faith. And it was a very moving ceremony. And then we left that, we piled into limousines, and we drove out to Andrews Air Force Base. And we got on that 747 that becomes Air Force One as soon as the president gets on it. And we fly to New Jersey, to Lakehurst, New Jersey. And we get off the plane and we get on a helicopter, met by the governor of New York and the mayor of New York City. And we fly out to the coast of New Jersey, fly up the coast, and there she is. And she is so beautiful. The Statue of Liberty. The torch was glowing. It was beautiful. And then you see a pillar of black smoke coming out of the tip of Manhattan. And the pilot of Marine One goes over to that pillar of smoke and circles it twice. No one says a word. We're looking out the windows, and we see thousands of people on the ground with hard hats on. We land over by Wall Street. We drive through the streets of New York, and I've been there many times with presidents, and usually there's lots of hellos. Some of them are single-digit hellos. But there's lots of people. This time, there weren't lots of people, but there were lots of people with hard hats on, getting ready to go down to ground zero, to do their thing, to rescue. And the president says to a Secret Service agent, I want to get out. And I can hear the communication within the Secret Service. Don't let them get out. These people haven't been through magnetometers. We haven't run their names on the computer. And he says, I want to get out. And they pull over and stop. And he gets out, and there they are with their hard hats on. And some of them are cheering. Some of them are crying. Some of them want a hug. And the president rallies them. And the crowd starts chanting, USA, USA, USA. And I look over and hanging off some of the scaffolding, cheering USA, USA with Canadian flags on their uniforms or Japanese flags on their uniforms. And then the president is standing near a crushed fire vehicle. And I say to him, would you be willing to say something? And he said, do you think it's appropriate? And I said, if you think it's appropriate, it's appropriate. If you don't want to do it, it's not appropriate. Where do I go? I said, I think we can get you up there. I went to a Secret Service agent. I said, can we stand up, have the president stand up there? And he jumps up on it and jumps up and down and says, thumbs up. Karl Rove finds a firefighter, Bob Beckwith, says, hold a spot for the president. The president said, what do I use to talk? I said, we're going to get you a bullhorn. I don't know how we found a bullhorn, but we found a bullhorn. I remember that. And the president gets up there, puts his arm around Bob Beckwith, and he starts to speak. And someone in the crowd says, we can't hear you. We can't hear you. And the president says, I can hear you, and the whole world will hear us. Remember that. Yeah. And the chants, USA, USA, echo. And at the same time, Congress is passing a declaration to go to war with only one dissenting vote out of all of the senators and all of the congressmen. The president finishes a very brief statement there, and the crowd is pumped, and we're excited, and we're all in it together. And we pile into limousines and go to the Jacob Javits Center, which is a huge conference room. And we see all of these blue pipe and drape booths. But in the booths are teams from every state in the Union and 38 other countries who were sending people to help us go through the rubble and rescue people. And the president went to every single booth. He took his picture, patted the dogs, and then he thinks we're going home. No, we're not. Take a turn in the Jacob Javits Center, which is a big enough building to take a turn. And we go to another room made out of of pipes and blue drapes. And this one is filled with people, and the president's saying, who are these? And we had invited family members of the folks who were missing down at Ground Zero to come. And the advancement said, there's a podium and a microphone, brief remarks, and leave. And the president said, I'm not going to the podium. And he just charges in the room ahead of the Secret Service. And there's a woman who stands up. She was only about 4 feet 5 inches tall, greets him. And then he goes, he talks to literally every single person in there, stayed there for over an hour. And everyone, he prayed with them, cried with them, hugged them. He's getting ready to leave, and he goes to the woman that first greeted him, and she stands up and looks him right in the eyes, and she holds out her hand, and she says to the president, Mr. President, I want you to have this. This is my son's badge. His name is George Howard. Don't ever forget him. And she drops the badge in the president's hand. Wow. He puts it in his pocket with tears streaming down his cheeks, and he says to George Howard's mother, America will forget. They'll move on. But you don't have to worry about me. I will never forget George Howard. Jeez. We leave, we get in the limousine. The president reaches into his pocket. I'm sitting beside him. He takes out George Howard's badge 1012. And he squeezes it, shuts his eyes. I believe he's praying, puts it in his pocket. We then fly back to Lakehurst in a helicopter, then fly on Air Force One, a very small jet, to go to Camp David. I'll never forget the president doing that, and guess what? We went to war. America answered the call to duty. Records number of people signed up to join the military, the fire department, the police department, medical assistance. So thank you. Never forget George Howard, and don't forget what happened on 9/11. Thank you very much.
What a terrific panel. Thank you all very much for what you've done, what you've seen, and what you continue to do to to ensure that we never forget. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. If I was supposed to go on you again, I'm sorry.
Come on.
If you've got before you leave the stage, if you've got a minute, why don't we've got a couple minutes here to take some questions from the audience. Would you
Bill.
mind?
I don't mind.
Bill, come on.
Okay, then I'll go back there.
Bill is right there.
While we're waiting for questions, there are a few things that I want to leave you with as you finish up your school and you get ready to take your oath of office.
He did not.
The reason why we're here to talk about 9/11 is not only so that you do not forget, but also so that you understand why you take that oath, what that ultimate sacrifice may require of you. And not only is it an obligation and a duty, but it is a privilege to serve our nation. Because who America is, what she stands for, what she means, how she brings all of us together is something that is more important and it's greater than any one of us individually. And every individual, every firefighter, every first responder, every police officer that rushed into the towers, not out, the passengers on Flight 93, they all intuitively knew that. But it's something that you will need to know every day when you wake up and you put on the cloth of our country. Know your job. When you get trained, be the first in your class. Because I didn't have time to go through normal start procedures. You're going to have to know your job inside and out. Know your team. Develop trust with your team. Love your team. Because when the chips are down, you're going to be getting through it together. Be willing to take risk. There's a point where, as an officer, you may be in a situation where you don't have the opportunity to say, "Mother, may I?" You got to buy your own bomb. Be willing to take risk, but do it smartly because you know that that risk comes with a cost, potentially. Not just your reputation or your evaluation form, but it could come with the cost of lives. And understand what that is, but do not let that make you afraid. You still have to be bold. And know your mission, know your purpose.
Thank you, Henry. Bill, we didn't get a chance to hear from you. I'm sorry, I jumped ahead.
Not at all. In fact, this is a rather difficult group of people to follow. So I'll do my best. And by the way, I know we just met. I will never refer to you as Snacko. So just real quick, just amazing listening to all of their stories. And I don't know what to say. I'll give you how I feel and my interpretation of what happened on that day quickly. I did not serve in the U.S. military, not because I didn't want to, but because my mother would not have let me do it. My father spent 4 years in the Navy in World War II. He was actually on a destroyer outside of Nagasaki right after they dropped the bomb in Hiroshima. The old joke was, well, that explains why your kids came out the way they did, because you were exposed to radiation. But he spent 4 years there. My mother lost her brother. Ernest Pasqua Post is named after my uncle, who was a bombardier pilot. His bunkmate was Clark Gable, if you can believe that. He was a handsome guy, and so was Clark, and I still have the handwritten letters that he would send to my grandmother about their escapades when they'd go out, which was kind of fun. But so I came from a family that served in the military, and I remember growing up and going to the American Legion an awful lot as a kid, and just the amount of respect that I have for all of you and all of you out there is immeasurable. And I thank God for all of you, and I pray for all of you on a consistent basis. 9/11, let's talk about it. I had just, ironically, begun working for, at that time, Dean Witter. In 1995, I was actually set to become a police officer, believe it or not, but there was a hiring freeze in my hometown, and I was getting itchy because I didn't have a career. I was getting sick of delivering pizza and parking cars. So someone convinced me, in their ultimate wisdom, to get into the world of finance. They thought I'd be good at it. So I did that and figured I'd kill time doing it until I became a police officer. Lo and behold, it kind of became very interesting to me. I enjoyed it. My mother was happy because she was worried I was going to become, police officer and potentially get killed. So I decided to stick with it. About 3 years after I did that, somebody decided, in their infinite wisdom again, that I'd be good in management. So they sent me down from White Plains, New York to the World Trade Center to begin a career as a management training associate. So the way we would work, just to kind of try to frame this for you, we were 8 managers in training that were assigned a rotating class, a 3-week class of individuals that passed the qualifying exams to become a financial advisor, and were basically shipped off to New York City for a 3-week sales training program. Each one of us would rotate and run the class, and it's ironic because my starting date in this program was 9/11 of 2000, believe it or not. And I was running a class which was scheduled to be my last class, because it was a 2-year program, that I'd be in charge of before they'd start sending me out to the field to get some field experience. So I was super excited. This is going to be the greatest class ever. I had everybody from the CEO of my firm down planned to attend this, and it was great. And the first day went off without any hitch at all. It was awesome. Everybody was great. We had the largest class ever, 276 people. Life is good. So that morning, when I woke up, full disclosure, I went to the Yankee-Red Sox game the night before. That didn't end up happening because it got rained out. But then the Giants were playing the Broncos, and I ended up going to a bar. So let's just say I got home a little bit later than I should. But I got up at 5 a.m., get ready to go in. It's about maybe 6:30, and I'm walking in the building, and it's a gorgeous day. The sun is out. It's beautiful, and I'm like, this is going to be a fabulous day. I can't wait to get through it. And when we had gotten in, we started our training sessions usually at 7:45. The first speaker that came in actually showed up 15 minutes early, ironic in life, but showed up 15 minutes early. So I said, do you want me to put you on now? I said, we have pretty much everybody in here. And he's like, yeah, he goes, I'd like to get out of here early. Okay, fine. So I put him on at 7:30. He subsequently finished 15 minutes early. And so, I decided, let me put everybody on break. Give you an extended break. You got a half hour now. You can go downstairs and do your stuff. So I did that. About 2 minutes after I did that, someone came running in from another room, and they go, hey, did you see what's going on outside? And I go, no, not really. They said, come with me. So I look, and I had started again in September of 2000, which was just in time for the Yankees when they beat the Mets, and they had a ticker tape parade in New York. And the only thing I could equate what I saw was the ticker tape parade was happy. You had all these wonderful things flying around. This looked like the ticker tape parade from hell. There was stuff coming out of just on fire. There were office equipment, chairs. I'm like, what happened here? And so I go back immediately to the room. I contact security. And for the year that I had been there, the head of our security was a gentleman by the name of Rick Rescorla. If you don't know who Rick is, you should know who Rick is, and I would encourage you to look him up. Rick was not only a hero that day, Rick was a hero in Vietnam. There's a movie called We Were Soldiers with Mel Gibson that was based on Rick's platoon. And Rick, wow, I didn't know Rick personally very well, but I certainly went through his training classes. And Rick beat into your head, if something happens here, exit the building. He was there for the bombing in 1993. It took 2 hours to get out of the building. And Rick became obsessed with the fact that if something goes wrong, exit the building and leave. So my first inclination when I thought about that was, let's get whoever's still up here and let's get him out of here. Let's go. Okay, I'll make the decision. I'll take it if it's wrong. But I'll take that decision and make it. And then, by the way, you never take the elevators. Rick taught us that, but I learned that just from watching disaster movies when I was a kid, that you never take the elevators. You open up the stairwell and send people down. So we start going down the building, walking down the stairwells. And we get to around the 50th floor. I was up on 61, which was a reentry floor. And there was an announcement that was made. I believe it was by the Port Authority, but I'm not going to throw them under the bus. But there was an announcement made that said Building 1 was hit by an aircraft, Building 2 is secure. Go back to your desks. So at that point, quite frankly, I said, I'm out. I'm done. Okay, I'm walking. I talked to a group of people that were with me. I said, let's just get downstairs. We'll regroup and we'll figure this out. Probably about 120 seconds or so after that, we get hit. Right then and there, when you get hit, the Trade Center, the way it was designed, it was a huge building. If you're a guy and you went to the bathroom and you were standing there trying to go to the bathroom, the building would sway sometimes with the wind, which made it a little bit difficult. But, you know, so when it got hit, the building took the impact, but it swayed like a pendulum from one way to another. And then listening to what was said before, real quickly, I remember thinking, I wasn't married at the time, but I remember thinking like, man, I wish I spoke to my mother this morning because I don't know if I'm going to get out of here. And it was amazing. You would think people were ridiculously panicked and it was absolute chaos. The two worst obstacles to overcome, believe it or not, were people that were a little bit heavy set and couldn't walk down 61 flights of stairs. And then the ladies were taking their high heels off and flinging them like guided missiles in a tight little stairwell there. So you had to be very mindful of that. But let me tell you, people bonded together and people were very, very organized despite the chaos is probably the only way I could describe it. And we ended up getting to the 8th floor, which is the observatory deck. And this is when I saw Rick. And I saw Rick coming up the escalator on the other side with his megaphone, just like George had, okay? And he's singing Cornish anthems and saying that this is a great day to be an American and we should all be proud. And I remember looking at him and going, well, I'm coming out of this building and I'm certain he's going back into it to save people. So I would tell you, it resonated with me because once we got out of the building, I had a decision to make. I said, you know, I went over to a police officer and I said, hey, I've got a group of people here. What do I do? He goes, honestly, get out of downtown. He goes, we heard there's another plane coming. Okay? That may have been what you were assigned to. So I said to the people, I said, look, I said, walk back to the hotels where we're housing you. We were housing people in 3 different hotels, the South Gate, the East Gate, and the Hotel Surrey. For those familiar with Manhattan, the South Gate was right across from Madison Square Garden. I said, go there. I said, I'll get up there eventually. We'll figure it out. Now, I sent them there. But I had a choice and decision to make for myself. And the decision was as follows. I lived across the street in Battery Park City, and the decision could have been, let me go hole up in my apartment, okay, quite frankly. I drank at the time, so probably with a bottle of vodka. But let me go hole up in the apartment and ride this out. 2, I could get on the West Side Highway and walk back to my parents. My parents lived in Yonkers. It would have been about a 12-mile walk. Or 3, I could do the right thing, which is walk back to these hotels and begin the process of figuring out, out of 276 people, did we get everybody successfully out of this building? Now, it took about a half a second for me to make that decision, and I thought about Rick real quick. I thought about Rick going back in the building, and I said, you know what? I'm walking to Midtown, and I'm going to do my job, and I'm going to make sure all these people are good. And, you know, I did that. It was an incredible 10 hours of my life trying to account for all of the folks that we had in these training classes. And, you know, I wasn't exactly, you know, educated on dealing with disaster relief, but I had folks coming up to me and going, you know, what do I do? I'm like, people were just frantic. So I was giving my credit cards, the ones that I had, to people and just sending them to the bar because I didn't know what else to do. So around 1 o'clock that morning, we had been at about 80% of the 276 people accounted for. And I said, I'm done. It's just been a long day, okay? So I went downstairs, I went outside, I said I better stop at the bar and close out my tab. This one's going to be painful. And I'll never forget, they were so incredible at this hotel. They didn't charge me at all. And then I went outside and I said, okay, you know what? Maybe it's time for me to relax a little bit here and get my bearings. And I started talking to, we had the state troopers and we had the U.S. Marshals based out of the hotel at that time, so I started talking to a group of them. But anyway, I remember walking around, and behind the Southgate Hotel, there was a fire station that we talked about. And I remember seeing, similar to the president, there was a crushed fire truck that I imagined when it pulled out was beautiful, bright red and gorgeous. And it was covered in soot. And somebody etched in the back, "God bless America." And I remember thinking, my God, what happened today? All I could tell you is you saw the worst in humanity on that day, and you saw the best in humanity, because I will tell you, people bonded together regardless of anything or any reason that people throw out there why we shouldn't bond together, which is all nonsense. At the end of the day, people bonded together, they came together, and they fought for the spirit of this country, and they fought for the spirit of humanity. And although I don't like to think about what happened that day, I do enjoy thinking about what I witnessed, which was just the strength of people coming together and unifying. So, God bless all of you. Thank you for what you do. And always remember the power of this country and the power of the human spirit.
Thank you very much.